just begin by saying that I became interested during this pandemic time in telling the stories of 3 mentions of pandemics in my book, Bold Women in Montana History. And so this is the first one, and it's about Myrna Loy. And it's kind of fascinating because if the flu epidemic of 1918 had not happened, Myrna Loy may not be a name that we know. Of course, she was a wonderful Hollywood actor, the highest paid female Hollywood actor in 1937, most famous for The Thin Man. And she grew up in Helena, Montana. Her grandparents were actually homesteaders in the Crow Creek Valley, which is near Radersburg, Montana, right near Helena. But when she was about 5, I think, they moved into Helena. And a couple of times, Myrna's mom, Della, was gravely ill and had to recuperate in Los Angeles. They sent her away. People did that then. The climate was better. So the whole family moved to Los Angeles, minus the dad, who stayed in Montana. And they loved Los Angeles, and they really wanted to move there. But the father, David Williams, and by the way, Loy is a stage name, so their real name was Williams. David Williams did not want to move to Los Angeles. He was a Montana guy, loved Montana, and he was a conservative man. And Della, his wife, was kind of a free spirit, so they were always kind of at odds with each other. And meanwhile, little Myrna, living in Helena, starts to study dance, and she really takes it very seriously. It's just becoming an art form at that time. But her father disapproves. He thinks of dance as vaudeville. So that there was that transition that happened, and he didn't go along with that transition. Anyhow, in 1918, probably because of marital unhappiness, David decides to go to war, and he's preparing to go to World War I and fight. He doesn't know that it's almost over, but he tells Myrna in preparation for going away to take good care of her mom and her little brother. And she takes that very seriously. She's about 12 or 13. And then, he's planning to go away, but all of a sudden his family gets the flu. So the epidemic is here. And the family gets the flu. David does not. He nurses them all very tenderly to health. Then he gets the flu and he dies. So what happens then is that Della takes the family and moves to Los Angeles. And that's where little Myrna grows up being exposed to the film industry, seeing actors on beaches and wondering about them. And she does a screen test. She actually starts in the film industry as a dancer. And then she does a screen test along the way. And if she fails miserably, but then she succeeds at the next one. And Rudolph Valentino really finds her, discovers her, that famous actor of that time. From then on, she is in movies nonstop, and she really is one of the hardest working actors of that time. She works for 10 years in multiple movies at a time without a break. And part of that drive, I believe, is because of what her father told her, to take care of her mom and her brother, and she was their breadwinner all their lives. So I recommend at this time, when we're often spending more time at home, that you check out a Myrna Loy movie, especially The Thin Man, and see how wonderful she is. The next one I'll do is about Pretty Shield, who was Apsallika, or Crow. And I only have one line about this in my book, but Pretty Shield wrote this wonderful book. Well, she didn't write it, Frank Linderman did. Pretty Shield actually couldn't speak English much. So they worked with a translator, and she told her story, and he wrote it down and made it into a wonderful book. So she talks more about the epidemic in her book, and I'll actually read a little bit from it. But when Pretty Shield was 16 and she was just married, her band that she lived with, so of course the Crow people and many Plains people are broken up into smaller bands who live together, and her band gets smallpox. It's passed to them from some Shoshone people. And so, Plains people had been experiencing epidemics, both of smallpox, but also of mumps and measles and other things, since the late 1700s. And I think that we don't think about that much anymore in mainstream America. We know that smallpox especially decimated Native peoples from the east to the west of the United States. But I think we have this sense that it was some kind of gradual tragedy, but I'm just, very aware right now, because 2020 is going to be seared into our brains because of COVID-19. It's the same in Native tribes' memories. And so Pretty Shield talks about this one epidemic in detail. And, but I will talk about, just some of the stories that affected Montana tribes and other Upper Missouri peoples. And there are specific stories. And so one story is takes place in 1837, when a trade boat was going up the Missouri. And, the Arikara tribe will remember that, and there's not many Arikaras left. So people with Arikara ancestry will remember that half the Arikaras were out hunting when that trade boat came through, and they did not get it. So that's kind of part of that story. Sioux people who lived near Fort Pierre, they actually got vaccinated, and the government provided a physician. Now the vaccine was available at this time, and the government was actually supposed to send vaccine and a physician out to tribes. And the person in charge of that decision was the war secretary, and they were at war with these tribes. So it's kind of a terrible situation there. And so the Sioux people were vaccinated near Fort Pierre, and they only lost 10% of their people, only. And there's just great stories of horror and loss from this one trade boat. Whole villages were wiped out, and it was so awful that individual people and their whole families would kill themselves. And that was because of despair and grief, and also preemptively. They wanted to preempt the disease. And so that becomes a secondary cause of death. Somehow that 1837 outbreak spared the Crow. The Crow were not affected by that one. The one that Pretty Shield lived through was in 1872, or around that time. So Pretty Shield, when she remembers it striking her band, says, quote, "We didn't scatter as we should have," which is interesting to me because it sounds like they knew from experience about social distancing, what we're calling social distancing, but they either didn't do it or they didn't do it fast enough. And so she goes on and she says, "Bad sickness entered every lodge. My people became terrified and died." Sounds kind of like us. Pretty Shield didn't die, like I said, because she was young, but it did kill about 100 people in that village, that band of people that she lived with, in just a month. And she remembers feeling helpless and hopeless and just wishing to die. And I think it's really interesting because I think because of COVID, we now have a sense of some big numbers. If you had asked me about 100,000 before, I would have had a vague sense of what 100,000 is. But now we're at 120,000 deaths, just about, as I'm speaking. And I definitely have a sense of what 120,000 is. And so you do too, I'm sure. And that one incident in 1837 caused an estimated 150,000 deaths among the various tribes along the Missouri. And that's, of course, a much smaller original population than the whole population of the United States now. An example is among the Mandan people, only 30 people survived, and they were either young or they were old and had been exposed to smallpox before. In Montana, the Blackfeet lost huge numbers, the Gros Ventres lost huge numbers, and other tribes too. But I did want to share another piece of Pretty Shield's story because it has to do with mourning. And we're all mourning, doing some mourning right now, whether it's for people or for normalcy or various things. As in many Plains tribes, the Crow people really intensely mourn when they mourn. And as a young mom, Pretty Shield lost a beautiful baby girl, and it hit her really hard. And for about 2 months, she wandered a lot, and she slept on hard ground, and she only ate enough to survive. And she had lost her will to survive, in other words, but she had other children, and she had other people to live for. So she wanted to live, she just didn't feel like it. And so she prayed for a medicine dream. that would keep her going, give her a will to live, and maybe even help her help other people. And so I'm going to read that section from her book. One morning, after a night spent on a high cliff, when I was returning to my lodge to pack things for a long move, I saw a woman ahead of me. She was walking fast, as though she hoped to reach my lodge before I could get there. But suddenly, she stopped and stood still, looking down at the ground. I thought I knew her, thought that she was a woman who had died 4 years before. I felt afraid. I stopped, my heart beating fast. Come here, daughter. Her words seemed to draw me toward her against my will. Walking a few steps, I saw that she was not a real woman, but that she was a person, an apparition or a spirit, and that she was standing beside an anthill. Come here, daughter. Again, I walked toward her when I did not wish to move. Stopping by her side, I did not try to look into her face. My heart was nearly choking me. Rake up the edges of this anthill and ask for the things that you wish, daughter, the person said, and then she was gone. Only the anthill was there, and a wind was blowing. I saw the grass tremble as I was trembling when I raked up the edges of the anthill as the person had told me. Then I made my wish. Give me good luck and a good life, I said aloud, looking at the hills. I was weak. In my lodge, there were no bedrobes for me because I had long ago destroyed all my comfortable things, and that's a piece of the mourning process. But now, in this medicine dream, I entered a beautiful white lodge with a war eagle at the head. He did not speak to me, and yet I have often seen him since that day. And even now, the ants help me. I listen to them always. They are my medicine, these busy, powerful little people, the ants. And so I love that because it just, out of mourning came gifts, spiritual guidance, power, because Pretty Shield went on to become a healer and someone who was capable of helping women give birth. Her family said that she was powerful enough to turn storms. And she definitely took bold action when her culture was threatened, as I talk about in my book, and preserved her family and her culture in part by collaborating with Linderman on that book.
Those personal stories make the numbers much more real.
I think it's one of the struggles of a time like this to keep it human and to remember the people that we're talking about.
What is your third story?
It's about the Women's Protective Union. And it's actually more about doing history. And part of why I like thinking about these things is because I think during a time like this, history can give comfort because people have been through these things before. So when I said that this story is about doing history, one of the most satisfying things about writing my book was this click that happens when you keep on having questions about somebody's life, and then all of a sudden they're all answered and they come together and you feel ready to tell their story. You feel ready to write their chapter, for me. The Women's Protective Union, I have a whole chapter on it, and my chapter is really on the union, which was for any working woman who didn't already have a union. And it was founded in 1890 in Butte, Montana, which was full of unions at the time, and of course, very focused on mining. And the Women's Protective Union was headed up for decades by these two women, Lena Matash and Bridget Shea, who were great colleagues. And their members, they talked about their girls. Their girls loved them, and they were working women who understood, and they fought hard for their members. One thing I talk about in my chapter is that at this time, and this is the early 1900s by now, at this time, if you were a woman and you had a family, you did not work. No matter what your income was, that just looked really bad for your family. Everyone would look down on you if you did that. So you stayed home, you took care of your house and your children and your husband. I dug into the biographies of Lena and Bridget because I wanted to give kids, and my book is a young adult book, more to some individuals to kind of know about versus a whole union of thousands of women. So I found out about Bridget's life, for example. She was an Irish immigrant. She came over when she was, I think, maybe 17, so she was older. And so there wasn't a lot about either of these women compared to some of the other women I wrote about, but I was able to interview some of their descendants, which was thrilling. Lena's nephew in his 90s, who's a great physician over in Butte. I talked to him. And Bridget, I was able to talk to her granddaughter who was in her 80s. And anyway, one fact of Bridget's life is always given, that her husband died in the flu pandemic in 1918. His name was James. And, I went to the archives and I looked at the rosters and stuff, and I saw that Bridget had joined in 1917. So that always bothered me. Why did Bridget start working and join the WPU when her husband died in 1918, a year later? And I tried to find that out, but it's a young adult book. They're not going to care. Kids aren't going to care when somebody died. It's not an in-depth biography of Bridget Shea, and it's a minor detail. So I went on. But it was the book was actually very close to being done and coming out when I visited Butte. Some dear friends there said, would you like to go see Bridget Shea's house? I was like, yeah. So we went over. It was only a few blocks away. And the woman who lives there is actually a historical researcher. So she gave us a wonderful tour of the house. And then we're standing there getting ready to go. And she says, you know about the murder, right? And I'm like, no, what murder? And so she goes away and brings back a newspaper article, and it tells the story of how Bridget's husband killed a man in a bar and went to jail. Actually, it's a trial. It tells the trial story of the trial. And so suddenly that click happened for me. Like, that was the one detail in my chapter that had gone untied up. And so that's why Bridget had to go to work. So I wondered why was this information so buried? Why had I not found it? And my theory is that it's shame, especially at that time. Either society would have looked down on Bridget for her husband's crime, or it threatened her position with the union, or she just hated the splash of dishonor on her husband's memory. And James did indeed die in the flu epidemic. He did die of flu, but it was at Deer Lodge that he died. Actually, that's not true, because I had to go on and I read about the trial, but I wanted to verify the facts. So I requested a record of the trial. There should be a record of the trial. And very interestingly, again, the file had a number and everything, but when the clerk went to find it, it was not on the shelf. It was missing. And of course, I love stories. So in my mind, Bridget, again, because of shame or dishonor, she had a lot of relatives. Maybe one of them worked in the courthouse and made that file conveniently disappear. But I really did want to still verify. So a friend of mine helped me request a record of James going into Deer Lodge. And so I was able to see his admittance document, where he has hair in one black and white photo, and he's been shaved. His head has been shaved in the one next to it, and he's admitted. But again, documents are very interesting and can tell you so much, because his death document actually does have him dying in Butte. So it makes me think that just like then, because of the pandemic, they sent patients home to die. But there's also another possibility, because I found out that James only got 3 to 4 years for this murder of an Englishman. He was Irish in a very Irish Butte. So I think that was that was considered the punishment for that. And it may be that he would, again, some Irish friend let him just go back to Butte to his family to die.
That is a fascinating story. And the story of research. So you interviewed people, you went to the archives, you found a historic home. Did you do that with all of these stories? Like, how do you find these stories?
Well, I had to choose my women first. And then, it sort of had to do with what was available or not as far as sources, information. And it really varied from person to person. Myrna Loy is so famous. Jeanette Rankin is so famous that Myrna Loy, there was just a really good biography, and there's not much else on her. And this biography was so in depth that it was fine. I had most of what I needed, although I did go to Radersburg. I did go to the cemetery and see all the Williamses, and I forget her mother's maiden name, but they're all there in the cemetery. It's very interesting. And I went to Crow Creek Valley. But Jeanette Rankin, there was almost too much information. But I did kind of make a vow that I wanted to go to every place associated with these women. And I got a wonderful grant from the Hansen Foundation to finance that. I often went to their graves. But this was kind of one of the more mysterious experiences.
Do you have any like wishes for what people would record and remember and write down? Like if you're, say, 100 years from now, looking back to this time, what do you think we should record?
I really just think it's hard to know what to record, but if you just are true to yourself and you just write stuff down, I think that could become valuable if those papers survive you. I feel like one of the biggest tragedies in my book is in the story of Annie Morgan, who was a Black homesteader who came to Rock Creek. She got there about 1887. And there are so many holes in her story that I just wish had been documented. And there's some documentation about her, but it's all by people that you can tell don't really understand her. I mean, she was surrounded by white people, and she was a Southern woman who came over here, and probably, it was good to not tell people much because of survival even. For example, she was a hoodoo practitioner, which is could scare people who are not familiar with that tradition of healing. So, but I just wish that we could tell more about her story. And thank goodness for documents like the census and other documents, because it's amazing how much they can tell. So everybody do your census, fill out your census.
Thank you. Well, these are wonderful stories. Thank you so much for sharing them. And we'll link to your book, Bold Women in Montana History. It's a very good book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Thank you, Sam.